Was Judaism only intended for this small nation living in the desert of Judea and in the mountains of Galilee, or did it have a universal vision?
I believe that from the beginning, the Jewish people already had a universal perspective, and we find this in the book of Genesis. It is written in chapter 12. That is when Hashem, God, reveals himself to Abraham, the father of our nation. And what he tells him is to go to the land, which is the land of Israel, and I will make you a great nation. For what purpose? In you, the nations of the earth will be blessed. Niwehu doesn't exactly mean will be blessed, but it refers to the nations. Nations of the earth, that is, we see here a factor, a narrative that has a territorial national aspect, because I will make you a great nation. And all families of the earth will be blessed. From the start, the Torah states the role is universal. So I think this was already the perspective and the interpretation, not only as seen throughout the Tanakh when the prophets speak again and again. I'm talking about before the term Judaism was coined, right? But then, as you rightly mentioned, practically any prophet talks about this relationship between the nations. Isaiah starts the whole theme by talking about this. Zechariah, in discussing the end times, addresses Israel's relationship with other nations and a universal harmony that includes their participation. That is, I understand the topic of Noahides. There are those who say, well, Judaism is for the Jews, but Noahidism is for the Noahides. I think that's wrong. I believe that Noahides are part of Judaism. The Noahide concept comes out of Rabbinic literature. It's a way of understanding how laws are broken down, let's say, these universal maxims, and that's part of Judaism. That is to say, the non-Jew who takes upon himself what are known as the 7 Noahide laws is part of the system called Judaism. Not so much the religion, he doesn't become Jewish, but he is part of this system. That is to say, from the beginning, it was already focused in that direction. Thank you.
But here's my question for you, because it's not the system we usually think of. We usually think of proselytizing religions, Christianity or Islam, where this category, because you're talking about a category where you are, but you're not. You're a category within it, but you're not part of that group. In Christianity, there are Christians, and those who are outside the church are heretics. In Islam, the categories can be Muslims, people of the book, and polytheists, heretics. In Judaism, many times, that's how we were taught, or at least roughly speaking, the world was seen with this dichotomy, Jew or Gentile.
Correct.
Where is it? First, are these two categories still valid? There are more categories. There are more. This is black and white, and there are shades of gray. Tell me how that works.
There's a whole spectrum. In fact, the term Noahide, to give you some context, where does the term Noahide come from? Son of Noah. In Jewish tradition, we know Genesis 9, they come out of the ark after the flood. Noah and his sons come out, and their God makes a covenant with Noah, with Noach. And in our tradition, we say that there the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach were given the 7 Noahide laws, let's call them, 7 Noahide precepts, although strictly speaking. And this is also shown by rabbinical literature like Sefari Karim. Yes, Al-Bodin. They show that these are 7 categories, not 7 laws strictly speaking, but 7 as maxims, as categorical imperatives, let's call them. And Herman Cohen also developed it this way, by the way. Herman Cohen writes about the Noahide laws from a Kantian perspective, but I'm getting way ahead of myself in time. Strictly speaking, the term comes from the narrative that humanity descends from Noah's sons. B'nai Noach is a term that appears in the Torah 5 times, but in rabbinic lexicon, it is a legislative category. As you rightly mentioned, there is this, let's say, way of categorizing, let's call it. There are Jews and there are non-Jews, the nations. But for the nations, there are also different terms. One of them is the term for an idolater. Yes, Obeda, Abodat, Kohabin, Akum, and all that, yes. But there are other non-Jews who have a category or are legislatively called B'nai Noach, Noahides, Toshav, which is the Noahide who lives in the land of Israel. Why was this language created? Because it's easier to know how to implement certain legal matters if you understand who you are addressing. That is, for example, you can't give the death penalty to a child because the child still doesn't know what their limits are, right? Even if they commit an act that would supposedly deserve the death penalty, in quotes, right? They fall into a different category, so you need to categorize them legislatively. What I just explained is mentioned by Hatam Sofer in his explanation. Hagiga, okay? I think it's page 33 around there. Here's the thing. I think the observation you made is very accurate. I'll take the 2 points you mentioned. People usually believe that there are Christians, Muslims, and Jews. From my view, that's wrong. In fact, if you read the earliest sources, Jews were not categorized as a religion. What exists is that there are Russians, there are Japanese, and there are Jews. Jews are a people. And as a people, there are all these perspectives about what applies to the people and all of that. That's one side. On the other, I'd like to quote philosopher Henry Bergson. Henry Bergson, who was Jewish, actually. He passed away, I think, in 1941, right before the Nazis arrived in France. And he says or puts forward the following, that Christianity, and this is kind of paraphrasing a bit what you just said, Christianity, says Bergson, is a truly universal religion. Not like the God of Israel, who is a God only for Israel. He is a particular God. On the other hand, the God of Christianity is universal, but actually it's the other way around, just as you put it. The one who is in the Christian faith has salvation. The one who is not is condemned. That's what you said in other terms, the heretics. They don't have that salvation. In Judaism, it's not like that. In Judaism, we don't see it as Jews being saved and non-Jews not being saved. There is a way in which the non-Jew also takes part in that system. And that's what I was referring to, that the non-Jew also takes part. In other words, the God of Israel also speaks to non-Jews so that they also conduct themselves in a certain way. And they too can have what we call the world to come. And all these concepts show that it's worth following this kind of behavior. The idea of the world to come is mentioned by Maimonides in the Hosmer Hahim, which he takes from the words of Rabbi Natan. These are very ancient sources. One of the oldest sources in Judaism says this, the words of Rabbi Natan. And basically, I think that was the question. What is true is that we Jews are not proselytizers. It's true. We Jews aren't trying to convert everyone to Judaism. Even though maybe the only in historical periods there were, and actually we were talking about that, I don't know if you remember, hey, last time, that there were specific periods in the time of once after the Maccabean revolt, there was proselytism of the Idumeans. There were flashes in history when this happened. But as a systematic part of Judaism, we don't call on people to become Jews. Why? Isn't it supposed that we have a universal message that everyone should become Jewish? But that's not the point. The thing is, there's also a message for non-Jews. That's one reason, along with historical factors for how this developed. And yes, basically, that would be it.
I think a lot of the things you're bringing up are interesting. And I'd like to round this out by revisiting a few points and opening up some other questions related to how non-Jews, the nations of the ancient world and other religions, have always found it hard to categorize the Jews. We have always been somewhat outside Western categories or outside the idea of religion as understood in Christianity and similar traditions. And also in this tension between the universal and the particular, nor is this Jewish phenomenon, this universal vision within Judaism, the simplest form of the universal. One could think of the universal as almost a blending of particularities, or something that is for everyone equally. But are you suggesting that Judaism, or the Torah before it was called Judaism, always proposed the idea of particularism of a specific people rooted in a land with a particular law for that nation, which is not and never has been about expanding it as is to the whole world? But part of that morality, part of that ethic, part of those teachings does have a universal perspective. It's fine, as I'm saying, that there is a particularism in the ritual, in the national, in the people, but the universal is expressed in ideas and notions, not in rituals.
Yes. In fact, what you mentioned is very similar to what Emmanuel Levinas proposes on this same topic about particularism, universalism within particularism. In terms of Levinas, who in fact is part of this school of thought that I follow, which is, let's say, a more Parisian, more French school, which is fine. The Rabbi and Rav Shirky and me. But what you're saying is exactly the point. We Jews do not aspire to be a single uniform religion for all humanity because it doesn't make sense. Several sages explain it this way, including a prominent Italian sage from just over a century ago, Rabbi Eliyahu ben Amozeh. He proposes, in fact, he is the one who coins the term Noahide, and he talks about what he calls the Noahide religion. He calls it something like that, but he explains this in detail, that it's not possible for there to be, I mean, he sees it as I explained to you, like they are 7 maxims, 7 categorical imperatives, but it's not possible. A Japanese person has the same spiritual need as someone from the Congo. Why? Because the historical development of the Japanese, their culture, their religious expressions, everything is very different. So you can't expect to impose the same religion on both of them. But there are 7 maxims that Judaism proposes, which are for the world, and each nation expresses them in a different way. That is the Noahide approach, and that's why what you mention, particularism, is not only the particularism of Israel. In fact, this appears in the Kuzari, a book by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, around chapter 4, where it says, Israel laumot kelev la'evarim, that Israel is to the nations as the heart is to the organs, meaning that just as the heart pumps blood to the other organs, Israel also has this role of pumping to the nations. But what does that mean? That a body in truth cannot live without the heart, but it also cannot live without a brain, and it also cannot live without a kidney or without any organ. You need all the organs in the same way. The people of Israel, Israel pumps, but you also need the nations. That is what you are saying. Each nation is very unique. And within that uniqueness, this whole system that Judaism is trying to articulate takes shape. That's why in Judaism they talk about 70 nations and not about one religion. 70 is, as they say, a kind of symbolic number in Judaism, which signifies abundance and multiplicity, faces of the Torah. It means many opinions, so 70 nations refers to many nations. The point in Judaism is to recognize this plurality. What we need to ask is whether there is this natural law or this principle behind everything, so that the nations can express their own particularity. That's basically what's being proposed.
That's a model that's not very accepted. Is it well known or not? The prevailing idea is this universalism based on a few 7 main principles, but then each nation adapts it to its own particularities, let's say. It's an interesting kind of universal union through just a few elements that we all agree, yes, through the revealed word of God according to Jewish tradition. These are the foundations, but then each one develops as it has developed. But I also want to challenge you a bit, really challenge you a bit. And so far, I've accepted all the points. Now I'm going to challenge you a bit. But when you read the Torah, doesn't it seem like there are 2 worlds? Either you're with us like Chapulín, Colorado, or against us. And if everyone accepts the Torah, fine. If not, it's polytheism. Heresy must be destroyed. Don't some fragments seem like the Islamic State? The Torah seems like the Islamic State. That everyone must be killed, everything destroyed and burnt, and nothing foreign should remain. And a professor, once he introduced me to the idea that in the past, polytheism meant each people had their own gods and so on, in a system much more tolerant than monotheism. That puts my truth above all others. I have the truth, so how? Oh. Because this method is very different from what you read in it, at the foundation of the Torah, with this idea of accepting this universality, right? And also something you don't see in the Torah, right? And we both know when Sanhedrin in the Talmud finds that through an allegorical reading. From which verse does each of the 7 principles arise? The Noahide laws, which sometimes aren't 7, they can be 8 or 9, depending on who counts them. One doesn't see it so clearly in the Torah necessarily, and there are some who see it as a bit far-fetched. How did you reach this conclusion? Others might be more direct, but the Torah doesn't clearly state it either. That model is at least outlined in the Rabbinic world, but not so clearly in the Torah. So how do we reconcile these 2 notions?
I would like to connect the first thing you said with the last thing you said. As you say, there isn't much consensus around the idea that there are no laws. So everyone expresses themselves however they want, under these maxims more or less. But what you're saying, this source from the Talmud, somewhere around 56, maybe 59, says, the verse from which these laws are derived is a verse that is said to Adam. First man, are you going to say it comes from here? Many explain, in fact, that this is because of Adam, and Midrash Bereshit Rabbah also mentions it, etc. This Rabbah also brings it, that it's given to Adam, because before Noah, the universal laws were given to Adam. What that means is that these laws are for the primordial human being. That's how it is explained. What about the categorical imperative in modern Kantian terms? But, I mean, that's why it is proposed to Adam before anything else. And this interpretation, which I should mention, is one given, for example, in Alonas's review, who is also from this school of thought. Meeting with Rav Kook. It's true that this is a modern interpretation because the state of Israel allowed us to give a more universal approach to what Judaism is. Instead of being in ghettos over there in a diaspora where they had to survive every day, just trying to figure out how to survive, understanding the Torah, but also wondering what we are going to eat today. Today in Israel, we can have much greater ambitions and perspectives, drawing from our own sources. So, if this is an interpretation that is becoming more and more popular in how reality is read, does that mean Rav Kook has become more popular in recent years, in the yeshivot, at least in the Dati Leumi ones? And about the Tanakh, yes, the Tanakh tells very strong things, but this is exactly the point, who the Tanakh is opposing. First of all, I want to speak from an anthropological and historical perspective. Just as there is the God of Israel and there are other gods, there is the God of Moab. And this is a struggle about what idols are, what an idol is. It's an idea, it's an ideology. If that's the case, what will the Midrash say? Abraham worked in his father's idol shop, and he would give an idol to each person. If someone asked him for an idol for a certain problem, he would give them an idol, which means he was giving them ideologies. That is, if your problem is that you are poor, and okay, the rich are very poor, I'm going to shape an ideology for you, socialism, this whole ideology. Take this placebo and that will save you. So, is it something like that? Then, the other gods of the other nations are other ideologies, that is, other perspectives on how to help the world. For example, because in ancient times you see that there are other accounts of the flood, like what ends up being the flood. But there's also the Epic of Gilgamesh in Amylis, which are, it's the same theological point, the same perspective on what is the answer, humanity, but explained from other approaches. So, the Sumerians had their own approach to what the solution to the world is, and they explained it through these representations, Gilgamesh. And this, we, Israel, say that's not it, that's not the solution, that's something that will lead humanity down the wrong path. Our approach is the Noahide laws, and that's why we explain our story the way we do, unlike other stories that have the same point. Yes, so if this is a struggle between ideologies, is it the same today? Nowadays, isn't there a struggle between them? We could say, between the God of Israel and the God of Iran, or the God of China. What is the God of China? Maybe the ideology of China, or the ideology of Russia, or the ideology of Iran, and then there's the ideology of Israel. And this is like a battle between concepts. Let's see who. Because it's true that you read Judaism, right? But it's written that if they practice idolatry, everything of theirs must be destroyed. That's one of the 7 Noahide laws, the 7 laws. One of them is not to practice idolatry. And the point of the Torah here is telling you that idolatry is not tolerable. Just as killing and stealing are intolerable, so is eating animals while they're still alive. It's the same thing. I mean, I think it's seen from a much more political perspective. It's much more about what we do, and everyone else is more... But rather, it's about the message we want to put forward in relation to other ideologies. What is the solution that we propose?